So I think other people will join. Why don't we wait another 30 seconds or so? But after all, people can watch the recording and they can chime in once things get going. A number of the medical students and the forms that they filled out had indicated that they might not come today. So the 22 people that we had in the first two sessions, I'm thinking there'll be somewhat fewer, but you know, the audience is quality. We don't need huge numbers. And I think there'll be a lot more people on Thursday. So, yeah, so Taryn, anytime you want to start.
Okay. Let me just get the chat up for myself. Okay, perfect. So you can see that all right?
Yes.
Yes, okay, good. So we will be continuing our discussion of transhumanism and social justice issues. This portion of the lecture kind of stems from my final project that I did last semester for this course, but I've kind of beefed it up and changed a few things around just for discussion's sake. So we will be going over scientific literacy, and specifically we'll be contextualizing that as a need for democratic decision-making. So how can we bolster people's decision-making, both in their personal lives, but also how they exercise their democratic responsibilities. And then we'll also be going on to kind of complicate that idea of autonomy a little bit more. And then after that, if we have time, we'll have a little discussion about misinformation. So hopefully this is kind of a review, but as I tried to kind of impress on you last week, transhumanism is still largely confined to academia. By academia, remember, we don't necessarily mean people who are part of the academy. They don't necessarily teach in an academy per se, but they might. Here's a few examples of, high-minded academic people. So there's scientists, entrepreneurs, philosophers. Each one of these folks has contributed in their own way to the project at large. Dr. Vitamore is big in cryopreservation. Elon Musk, of course, has various projects on the subject. And Donna Haraway is very inspiring to me because she kind of talks about feminism and technology. And keeping in with that theme, when we're having these conversations about transhumanism, they're often taking place in these academic circles. So, people write professional literature, they attend conferences, presentations, and they also have, exclusive events. And obviously this is starting to change. There was that H+ Academy this weekend, and so there slowly is a movement to try to get, the average person more involved. But when we're thinking about how this can impact, the everyday person, it's kind of, there's that disconnect, right? Of them being maybe in their ivory tower, if you will. And even if there's an effort to come out of that ivory tower, is it working quite yet? We don't know. So again, science doesn't happen in a political vacuum. Academics are often held in high esteem. We have scientific advisors who weigh in on different policies. They recommend, of course, with COVID, there's a lot of scientists doing a lot of important work in the public eye. And, whether our leaders choose to listen to them or not, that's a different story, but often they're held in high esteem. And then science can be revolutionary. We can fundamentally change how we operate. And we can also produce really harmful technologies, even if they're not intended for that purpose. some technology has the potential to do a lot of harm. And so we need to make sure that there are systems to hold this project accountable. And if you remember how I described transhumanism earlier last week, I situate it within the overall current of, scientific progress. I think that it's really important for us to just consider how we can hold scientists and people in the academy, but specifically here, transhumanists, accountable, especially when they're trying to come up with these really big solutions. We want to make sure that those solutions are actually in the best interest of the people that they're supposed to help. So when people are doing, like a common way that an academic might try to get this outreach is by, interviewing university students. They're always in steady supply, asking different people in the community. But they found in this study down here, you can look more into it there, but they found that a lot of those study participants they surveyed, it's kind of a meta-analysis, and they looked at all these different analyses, and they found that a lot of folks represented in those studies were, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. And so that background of people being, one certain type person kind of limits the perspectives that we're considering. And so even though, these kind of people, these kind of societies only really make up 12% of the world's population, they often are seen like 80% of the studies that we're conducting. So it's this underrepresentation of maybe what the global community is interested in. But that's kind of an aside. So if we're thinking about, well, we want this system of accountability. We want to be able to hold these folks accountable. We want to give people a voice, within the transhumanist community there, and within just the broader community, right? There are kind of a few different ideological approaches to this system of accountability. So, an libertarian approach is very hands-off. They sometimes call it the Californian ideology. So if you think Elon Musk, I can't speak to all of his political beliefs, but I would say he on the whole has a very hands-off kind of let things run their course approach. Whereas others might more reflect what you would see in the Democratic Party in the United States, maybe more government, but still capitalism. And then the third kind of major ideology would be anarchism, which sounds really bad to most people, but it is an ideology that's more like communism, but without one central leader. It's very focused on, spreading that power to everybody. And they're decidedly anti-capitalist. So you could say that, maybe the free market could be a way for this accountability system to function. But there's, first of all, not agreement on whether that is the best idea. And then maybe some support to suggest that, trickle-down systems aren't the best, or I won't give you an economics class, but amongst these ideologies, there's a fairly general consensus that democracy is the goal, What do we mean by democracy? We really mean ruling by the people, having people have their voices heard, have their needs met. Democracy has to incorporate elements of social justice and equality, and it really centers on a very deliberative, conscious effort to represent the people, the people's needs. And so you're probably familiar. Representative democracy is pretty much what we see in most places where we elect a leader. And then there's direct democracy, which is maybe more what an anarchist system would favor. And that refers to more direct individual participation. But really, we do see a mix of both, right? Like we have polls sent out to folks, to get their direct opinions. We have people writing to their elected officials. It's kind of a messier process, but this is what we mean when we say democracy. We mean that people will actually get to have their voice heard. And so when we think about a society that is becoming increasingly reliant on science and technology, and if we're, expecting all of these magnificent technologies to be coming down the pipeline, we need to make sure that the citizens are, capable and confident in interacting with that reality. And so this is where scientific literacy comes in. So here we mean scientific literacy as a skill set. So folks should be able to tell science from non-science. They should be able to kind of evaluate science and understand its roles and, be able to look at something and kind of understand the risks and the benefits. And then they should also be able to critically engage with scientific issues, right? I don't know, I keep going back to vaccination as my example, but it just feels all too relevant, If people are hesitant to get the vaccine, or if they don't understand how to, maybe let's say there is good reason to be hesitant of the vaccine. Like, how are people going to engage with that reality? How would they voice their opinion? How would they be able to understand and weigh those risks and benefits and then communicate what they want? But when we're talking about this type of scientific literacy, it's important to note that we're not talking about a system that merely replicates itself. We want to encourage a population so this is a thinker, Gutmann, who advocates for social reproduction, conscious social reproduction, instead of social replication. So replication would be just handing over the values. This is what it is. This is how it always has to be. But as a transhumanist community, as a community interested in progress and, advancement, we want people to be able to evaluate and decide what they want to bring along. She, in her paper, talks about 3 different main values that need to be upheld and encouraged for this social reproduction, to occur. So she talks about non-repression, which is basically, free thinking. People need to have the space and to be encouraged to, rationally choose among all the different options that are out there. Non-discrimination. She's talking specifically about like education and politics, but we can think about that in the greater like transhumanist project, the scientific community, as just trying to reduce the barriers that people face, right? Making sure that education is accessible to all. And then her third point is that we need forms for that critical discussion. We need for those discussions to be happening at different levels of government, in different kinds of groups, and they really need to be free and open to truly question, like rationally, critically engage with the social, political, scientific realities. And so, because I'm going into this in detail a little bit, because I think it's really important to emphasize that, scientific literacy and the good that this can do for folks is not just like a dogmatic thing. We're not just telling them what to think. We're encouraging people to critically engage, and then, like they can teach us eventually. They have thoughts, bring it to the table, we'll evaluate together and grow. And so she outlines values that need to be upheld for such a system to work. People need to be able to be be willing to be honest. People need to be not violent, tolerant, all of these things that actually facilitate this type of discussion. And so now that we kind of have a little basis for what we mean by scientific literacy, it's time to look at, what good is it? I think I kind of alluded to that earlier, but there are micro social benefits. So we can enhance people's autonomy. We can help people take control and take their decisions into their own hands and evaluate what they need for their lives. But there are also those macro social benefits that I alluded to strongly. Having people participate in democracy and to thoughtfully critique the shortcomings of science and actually, participate. And both of these things kind of feed off of each other, right? Like the decisions you make in your personal life also have ramifications in like the broader sphere, right? If you're supporting one technology over another, that support, whether, financial or if you're advertising it, that kind of butterfly effects and, shows support for one thing over another. And so when I did my project last semester, this was my main focus. So talking about different ways that this scientific literacy could be accomplished and should be accomplished, and what we as transhumanists, as scientists, as academics, whatever this imaginary community is, how we can actually help facilitate these changes. And so my first point is that we need to really facilitate access to academic discourse. So this means giving people the tools they need to read science, to understand science, and to also, have kind of a two-way communication system. I feel like often we just kind of read science, if you even read science, but there's really no way to voice your opinion, or if there is, you have to kind of look for it. And so, I suggested various ways. You can watch my presentation on Dr. Soliz's channel if you want to know kind of the more details, but we can use visual abstracts to help start communicating things more effectively. We can use hyperlinks and things and maybe create like a Q&A approach for actually getting people engaged with science. We can also legitimize novel forms of outreach. So we can build infrastructure to communicate in new ways. We can collaborate with visual design people and have them make amazing videos. I'm sure you've seen them, right? Like all those ways that they help you break down these really complex concepts and get them into your hands. And then we also need to incentivize people to actually pursue scientific literacy, right? We need to communicate the benefits of being scientifically literate, help people understand how it can help them be more active in democracy, help them understand, how it can benefit their own personal lives. Some of my suggestions for how to do that involved, maybe making some sort of certification process, like your first aid training. You can be trained in scientific literacy. You can also maybe try to actually engage people more on social media, which is a project that I'm actually going to be, I'm sort of working on now, but we'll be taking a little more seriously in the future. Before I move on, does anybody have any questions? I know I kind of, it seems off topic, no? Okay, everybody's good. That's what I like to hear. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about autonomy, and it's important to talk a lot about autonomy, as Dr. Van Manen will show you later in the course. It's one of those fundamental pillars for healthcare and really for our society, our democratic society. But what autonomy means is, having someone be able to make a choice that aligns with their wants and needs, right? They want to get the Neuralink, they get it. They can evaluate things, they're their own person, they get it. But there are, a series of barriers that actually kind of complicate autonomy a lot more than it might seem on the surface. And so these are kind of more of those structural barriers that we were talking about, well, and the like social barriers that we were talking about last class. The status quo influences what an individual might want, or what they might need, or they might feel pressure to make one decision over another. And then, the nature of the available choices also really limits what an individual can do, right? And these are then in turn affected by, all these different incentives. Why would someone make this technology? Is there market pressure? Is there a medical need for it? Is there an ethical reason that said technology needs to be made? And so there's this whole system that actually influences which choices we can make. And so the best example that I can think of is the file drawer phenomenon. So first, epistemology is kind of a field of knowledge that really asks, how do we know what we know? How is it that we come to know things? How is it that we come to understand things? And kind of as an extension of that, why are we making the things that we do? What are we doing with this knowledge? And so if we think about the things that we do know, we also have to think about the things that we don't know and the things that we don't pursue. So this is a feminist concept, epistemologies of ignorance, which describes, why are there things that we don't know? Why aren't we pursuing more information about certain topics? Why doesn't this matter? Quote, and so the file drawer phenomenon refers to an underpublication of negative or neutral results. Findings often get left in the file drawer, if you will, because they're not interesting or they don't have a positive claim. And this leads to a huge bias because we can't fully evaluate the effectiveness of something. We can't fully understand the full scope of whatever the research is supposed to be on. And you can see this in this nice chart over here, right? These are strong results, and they actually do get published. This is what the yellow shows here. But then, null results very hardly get published. But, negative data is so important. It tells us a lot more than people think it does. And so I'll post this TED Talk in the e-class form. I just didn't think we should spend time watching it, but in the TED Talk, he talks about this antidepressant called Reboxetine. I don't know, but he talks about how they were doing this trial for this drug, and they did all these trials, and they compared it to a placebo pill. And when they compared it to a placebo pill, 6 of the 7 trials showed that it was no better than the placebo. But one of the trials showed that it was better than the placebo. And that was the study that got published. All of these didn't get published. And then they also compared it to other antidepressants to see, first of all, comparing it to a placebo, if it's neutral or just a little bit better than a placebo, does it really work, right? I don't think we care if we could just be taking some sugar pills. We want to see if it actually stacks up to the other medication that we have. But when they did that, they found that there were 9 studies that had negative reviews. They found that people on this medication actually had worse outcomes than other medications. But they found 3 that said the drug worked just as well as the other antidepressants. And those were the ones that got published. So this was a controversy, Doctors are looking in the literature. they're wanting to make, wanting to conduct evidence-based medicine. They're prescribing this drug because they see these studies, but they don't know that these are actually hidden away. We don't advertise these kind of things. And so this leads to, this is just one example, but this happens in a bunch of different industries. Wow. Where folks won't share their negative things, or they'll kind of be a little deceptive and make things seem better than they actually are. And quite frankly, as much as I advocate for scientific literacy and this is going to empower people and help them make these decisions, when we have these practices, these, systematic issues, it doesn't matter how scientifically literate you are if you can't actually, have the tools to make the decisions. And now we'll get to another issue with understanding autonomy, and why, just having the knowledge and having these tools isn't necessarily the best way or the fullest way to help people. Okay, so I'm borrowing from a thinker named Susan Sherwin. She has probably influenced my perspective on this topic the most out of anybody. And she talks about relational autonomy. So for her, autonomy is not just the presence or absence of a degree of autonomy. It also requires that the person has the opportunities to develop the skills that they need for making these type of choices. They need to have experience of being respected in their decisions. And they also need to be encouraged to actually, define their personal values, to actually figure out what it is they want. And so these are just, I should have just given you guys the whole paper because it's a really, really influential, every word she writes just hits me. But she says that under relational theory, selfhood is seen as an ongoing process rather than something that is static or fixed. Relational selves are therefore inherently social beings that are significantly shaped and modified within a web of interconnected and sometimes conflicting relationships. So what she means here is that we as people have kind of this web of relationships, to other people, to politics, to, all of these different things. And the way that we sit in that web impacts how we make our decisions. If we are really strongly tied to a certain family member, or if we're really strongly tied to a certain political position, that might influence the decisions that we're making. And at the same time, she says that forces of oppression can interfere with an individual's ability to exercise autonomy by undermining her sense of self as an autonomous agent and by depriving her of opportunities to exercise autonomy. So in this web of relationships, there are these different hierarchies of power, etc., that we are kind of navigating. And within this web, we are sometimes given opportunities to make decisions, but other times, people who might not have that power in those different relationships, they might not actually ever get to experience speaking up for themselves or making decisions for themselves. Maybe someone just always told them what to do, or someone, the list goes on, right? Of different ways that people might be undermined in actually practicing this decision-making process. And so, this is further an issue of we want to empower people and help them make decisions. We want to give them, a plethora of different options to choose from. Transhumanists are huge in wanting to just provide all these options, give people the choice to make these, to choose whatever they want. But it's not that simple. And then lastly, oppressed groups are often portrayed as irrational. So this is something that Sherwin talks about as well. Women are seen as hysterical, perhaps, and this contributes to, those power relations in that web of people, not being taken seriously or not being encouraged to actually think, like, even if they are behaving rationally, they might be doubted, and that can kind of have like a feedback loop. And so, yeah, women are often more likely to receive anti-anxiety medication. So if they're reporting to the hospital with some sort of physical ailment, it's often just written off as like, oh, they're, just hysterical, they're upset, even if they know their body and they know that they need something specific. And then this one we can talk about more too, if you're interested, but atavistic traits they're thought to harken back to like a primitive state. The book that I'm kind of referring to here is by Amy Farrell. I don't remember how to pronounce her name, but it's a study about how fatness on the body is read as something that makes someone primitive and makes them, like, it doesn't actually make them, but it's perceived as making them inferior, as holding people back. And so when we're talking about, these social projects like transhumanism, humanism in general, that are really focused on progress, these atavistic traits that are read onto other people's bodies are often used as like a blame, like, oh, has anyone seen WALL-E? Anybody? Okay, yes. So in WALL-E, it's kind of like a thank you. WALL-E's kind of like a futuristic movie, and it's rather dystopian if you really think about it. They don't paint it as a very pretty picture. And so there's this analysis, and whether you agree with it or not, we can talk about that. But there's an analysis that suggests, the way that they're portraying fatness, all those people floating around in their chairs, they're all fat. And I'm using the word fat, like that is the term that like the activist community uses. So you don't need to be like afraid of offending anybody. But yeah, it's seen as like something that's holding us back from progress. And so if we're, having this person trying to make this decision or trying to have them involved in the transhumanist community, but if their body looks a certain way or they feel that their body looks a certain way, they might not want to engage with these projects, or they might feel discriminated against because of certain things. And these aren't like, no one's going to walk up to someone and be like, your body sucks. Like, people are a lot more subtle than that, right? But nonetheless, it factors into these decision-making processes. And so both of these kind of combine and ultimately leave people in what is called a double bind. And so this it can refer to like it's like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. When someone kind of has two sucky options. And so this can actually be like, like we were talking about earlier, there just aren't great options out there. Like maybe they just don't exist yet, or they haven't thought about developing them, they don't care. But it can also refer to that like social pressure. If you're overweight and you go to the gym, like you're supposed to be at the gym because you're supposed to be getting healthier, you're supposed to be getting skinnier, but at the same time, like that kind of body isn't supposed to be at the gym doing those things. And so you're kind of stuck between this reality of like not having the best option. And the same goes with, if a woman has pain, or let's say she is having mental health issues and she goes to the hospital, like she's kind of damned if she goes to the hospital because she might be judged, but she's also, stuck if she doesn't go to the hospital, because then she's really being irrational, right? Then she's not taking that her care into her own hands. And so, together, all of this really complicates like what we mean by autonomy, what we mean by being able to give someone like a free and fair choice, which I hope if you were able to make it to the talk on Thursday, you can see that that was like a big point in, or a big value for transhumanists, right? This big emphasis on autonomy and making sure that people can do all these cool things in the future. But there's clearly a lot of issues still with that. Yeah, I want to hear your thoughts on what I've said. You guys are quiet.
So one sort of question I have about like questions of autonomy and personal choice is what of situations where, personal choice or even like choice or decision making in one country has impacts on everyone everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the introduction of cars, like it might be like a personal choice, like, okay, I'm going to buy a car, but then the exhaust goes to the atmosphere and we all share the same air. So sort of how are those spaces sort of navigated?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, right? Like when we're taking that, I don't know, Californian ideology, that very like hands-off, oh, I'm making the choice to do this, I'm, whatever. Like I think it's really problematic, right? Like it's really dangerous when people can get, I don't want to say get away, but when there aren't those ways of holding people accountable, right? In theory, you would hope that these people making these potentially impactful decisions are weighing the consequences. You're hopeful that they're looking at best evidence, that they're making these informed choices, but like who are we to enforce that, right? How can we actually make sure that people are abiding by these things? I think that's definitely a huge concern for like this, I say transhumanism, like this whole project of inventing new powerful technology. Like how are we gonna make sure people are using it properly? Yeah, no, I don't have like a proper answer for you, but I think you're definitely right that it's something we need to pay a lot more attention to.
I guess in extension, I was wondering if you feel that different government structures or like political systems that could facilitate maybe a better like control or let society use that technology better, like either through enforcement or regulation in any way. Like in a democratic capitalist society, it's kind of whoever comes to the market first with something like this and abides all the basic rules set out by the government can profit off of it. And you can see like with social media, it was something that not many people knew about when it came out and are causing a bunch of problems now. It usually you usually look at it in retrospect and say, okay, this isn't working, then we have to change it. But depending on what the government would be, they could be more strict in regulating it. Like in China, they have a lot of systems in place that you need to work with the government to instill and use these technologies. And it's very, like, there's a lot of communication between the government and the body of people using that technology as well, that you might not get in a capitalist democracy. So I was wondering, like, do you feel that the government or political structure has, in terms of impact with technologies that are coming out or new technologies?
Yeah, I mean, to out myself politically, I definitely, like, as I was reading more into this whole transhumanist project, and like when we're thinking about these things, like we really have to think philosophically. We can't just think about the systems that we already have, like we can totally invent new ways of holding things accountable, new ways of doing things, right? If these systems, like you're saying, like, capitalism my opinion, isn't really doing the best job at holding these huge companies accountable. You know, are we just gonna stick with this system because we have it? I mean, I don't think we have to. But I don't know that there really is, like, it's hard to say what the correct answer is. I personally am kind of in favor of this like anarchist way of dealing with this, which sounds crazy when I tell my family about like anarchist transhumanism, like they think I'm crazy, and I am, but you know, if we're looking at the technology that we could potentially develop, you know, like if theoretically, if we cared enough, we could create a system for people to vote, like directly vote on certain issues all the time. If we could make some sort of technology that we actually trust to be secure, and we make sure that people have access to it, you know, we could actually start putting more power directly in the hands of people. You know, we could have more of a representation of like what people actually want and using that to hold these corporations accountable. But at the same time, like we can't do that overnight. Yes, I think I see a hand up.
Hi. I
Yes.
just have a reaction on what you were just saying on anarchy and putting the powers in the hands of people.
Mhm.
I think that's kind of like a paradox
Yes.
because if you look at the US now, you see a lot of craziness going around there. And I would say at least 50% is because of people thinking that they have the power and they have the rights to take over the government, or a lot of people who think that they are smarter than the government and smarter than what is out there right now, which I think causes a lot of craziness and chaos. So I do think that the government should be responsible to hold back a small percentage of information or new technology, because if we put everything out there, we cannot guarantee that there are people who will use it to their advantage and use it to do bad causes.
No, I definitely agree. Like that I was going to come full circle and be like, this is this great idea. We have all these, you know, the possibility to have direct democracy, but we can't get there overnight. We do need some sort of structure to start building off of to hold people accountable. I see other hands up. One of you, there's two people that have hands up, so one of you just go.
Okay, I guess I'll go first.
Okay, perfect.
Well, I going back on your idea of sort of direct democracy, I think one of the first things that really needs to be solved if we are to go down that path is like when you sort of go into research and like and you pay attention a lot to politics, you start to pick up on certain buzzwords and that both sides sort of use to criticize each other. Specifically, I'm talking about like the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States, because they are sort of usually known as like the example of democracy in the world. Probably less so lately, but I feel like with the advent of like social media and stuff like that, both Republicans and Democratic representatives keep calling each other, but keep saying that each party sort of lives in their own, and this is one of those buzzwords, echo chambers. And I think they're both right in the sense that if you are on Twitter or if you're on Google, if you read left-wing oriented papers or things that just support left-wing ideology, then you're just going to be continuously recommended the same thing. And if you read Republican and libertarian pieces of news, you get recommended the same thing, and you get recommended everything on the left side of the spectrum, even the crazy stuff and like the more moderate stuff, and then people on the right wing get all the crazy stuff and the moderate as well. I think if we're looking at the previous elections, I don't think one side is just completely crazy and racist or whatever. I think a lot of people sort of subscribe to the old view of democracy where like the Democratic and Republican parties sort of just represent simply economic ideals, and not that it wasn't always tied to racism or that all that sort of thing. So now that politics inevitably is tied to race, whenever someone from the left sort of proposes a new economic policy, it's already tied to like or socialism or communism, and then whenever someone on the right proposes their economic value, it's they're racist or they don't support economic equality and that sort of thing. So I feel like we should do away with a lot of the stuff on social media where it's very beneficial for the social media companies to keep recommending back in the echo chamber, because it does sort of give them more power in the in society. So I feel like I'm not sure how to solve it myself, but a suggestion would sort of just be having government regulated. But yeah.
I like that. Yeah. It's a very like I'm not pretending to have any of the answers here. Like this is a very complicated issue, and it's not just limited to transhumanism, etc. If you guys want, like as we're discussing, if you have like thoughts, you can go to the Jamboard, because that I wanted to talk eventually about misinformation. So if you're not talking, you can go there. I think I have So Young next. Did I pronounce your name?
Yeah, it's like the opposite of so old.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, that's how I usually explain it. So I think that like ultimately government's responsibilities are to create spaces where people are not having to, like, I don't think that despite what people's belief systems are, people don't like act out at once collectively, like the chaos that we saw in Capitol. Like the government has created this culture and narrative or like a societal perspective for a specific demographic group of people, but there has been this like space created where people are now having like agency to create chaos collectively, which is quite concerning. But I think that this, because we don't really know how people's experiences are going to be when we have all these new technologies and how people will use those, I think like our focus really needs to, when it comes to regulating and prevention, it needs to be like creating a space that like prevents crimes, you know, like where we maybe change the ways that we approach education, maybe change the ways that we approach political debates, and like create a system that is sustainable and almost as like a safe space as like a preventative method rather than like creating regulations, because that in turn just creates like a struggle for power balance and like people to like, and then will result in this extreme divide of like the political spectrum. I hope that makes sense. I've had a lot of caffeine today, so I'm kind of
It's good.
Everything's kind of
Yeah, no, it's definitely like it's such a hard, like I'm particularly interested in the role that, because I see social media as a technology, right? Like as this tool, and it's just kind of there. And I think we're now just realizing what that really has the potential to do. And I think you're right, like we need to be able to have these civilized discussions, but also have them in a way that is constructive and open-minded, but still not angry and violent.
Like the whole use of, like, a really great example, I think, is Twitter. And how everything right now is kind of getting thrown on Twitter, and there's so much information that's being conveyed, but also hate. That's also like how Proud Boys are using media as a way to collect, recruit members and staff. And I think we're at this, like, I think as we have, a lot of folks have said, we can't rely on people to be rational agents. And like, because it's human nature. It's not, we have come past a point where we no longer, like, it's not enough for people to be responsible citizens. Because we are in such an interconnected world we live in. Like, everything is on the interwebs and whatnot. And so I think it's, we need to really, like, shift our focus from, like, how can we control situations and how can we address situations, to, like, how can we prevent and create spaces that would prevent misuse of technology, probably through, like, understanding how oppression and privileges are produced, and how power goes into play and whatnot. But
like the article that I referenced in the presentation, the like it was actually called Scientific Literacy for Democratic Decision Making, and their whole shtick is that, you know, we need to be able to bring in, like, you know, teach science, tell people, like, help people develop these critical thinking skills, but at the same time, you know, not be afraid to bring in those kind of sticky questions, right? Like, actually bring in these conversations about power and structures of power and how we can, you know, mindfully navigate all of this mess. Like, we can't talk about them as if they're separate issues, because increasingly we're seeing that they're not. I think I'll move on to Nadia, if that's okay. I think you still have your
Sorry,
hand.
I was just about to
Okay,
lower
good.
my hand because I was like, oh, there's so many other hands. But I would just like to say that, like, with a lot of these solutions we're discussing, in my mind, it's sort of very, like, reactive. Like, as a student in education, as a pre-service teacher, a lot of my opinions are that, like, we should, like, sort of prepare students for these problems ahead of time. The earlier the better, when they're actually in school. And sadly, our education right now and our curriculum, which sadly, like, the NDP's curriculum got, like, canceled by the UCP, but our curriculum sort of currently in Alberta and elsewhere in the world fails to really tackle things like scientific and digital literacy. And I feel like if we teach kids to, you know, treat things on the internet with caution, and we give them the tools to sort of, you know, have their own autonomy on the internet, like, I think it will kind of negate the need for some of these, like, reactive solutions.
No, I definitely agree. And I think that, like you said, like, it should be a very proactive, very, like, not just posting something in some, like, deep, dark place of the internet and, like, hope that kids are going to find it. Like, we actually need to make a point of having these points in our education system, having them on our, you know, having them on social media, like, reaching out to people, encouraging critical thinking. I'm still trying to figure out what that all looks like, but, you know, it's definitely, you're right. Like, it can't just be something that we kind of shrug at, and then when something bad happens, we all start caring about, because I think there's been enough reason for us to care about it at this point. I'll go to Noreen next. Thanks.
Yeah, hi. What I wanted to comment on was something that Anne said. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I lived the majority of my life in Egypt, so that's a developing country. That's a pretty extreme example of what I'm about to say. I think, Anna, you said something about having the government hold back some information from the public. But having lived the majority of my life there, in the 2005 election for the presidential election, only about 23% of people actually voted. This is because they distrust the government and the electoral process so much that none of them actually showed up to vote. And so a military dictator won the election. And that led to the uprising in 2011 of the Arab Revolution and a whole lot of chaos. And while we're obviously not that bad in Canada, what I wanted to comment on is I don't think the government should be able to hold anything back. I think all of the information should be available to the public, which I also think will help with the scientific literacy and education of people, because when they want it, they can actually access any information that they need, so they don't feel like, I don't know, they're being cheated out of something, or that the government is hiding something from them, because it leads to that distrust. And, it has people holding back and refusing to actually participate because they don't think, A, that it matters, or B, that, you know, like someone will be regulating it, someone will be removing it, no one's actually going to see it. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, no, I definitely, someone in the comments brought up like that kind of ties back to the whole like that file drawer phenomenon, right? Like, how are we going to actually, as citizens, not only concerned for our own well-being, but for the well-being of the society that we live in, like, how are we going to know what to trust? How are we going to know what the right decisions are? How are we going to know that our leaders are actually like acting in our best interests? And you're right, it does totally lead to voter apathy. People just give up. They feel like it's overwhelming, or they feel like it doesn't matter. And that breaks down the whole system. But it's hard to get people to care. Like Nadia was talking about, like proactively, like how do you get people to care and to engage with these issues before something, you know, catastrophic happens that makes them care about it? I don't know. And how do you prevent it from like just repeating itself? It's messy, right? I'd like to hear what De Chang says. Also, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong.
That's totally okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. So I have a discussion question that I was a little bit curious to hear your thoughts, and that's how we balance autonomy with the requirements that you stipulated is needed for autonomy. So the example that I have in mind is scientific literacy is one of the things you mentioned that you need for autonomy. But using religion as an example, right? I don't want to say that religion is necessarily mutually exclusive with scientific thinking, but I think it's fair to say that there's a pretty big overlap between religion and kind of anti-scientific sentiments. And so if we are to say that scientific literacy is required, wouldn't that be going against the autonomy of the people who follow religion by saying that their ways of thinking are wrong? Does that make sense?
No, this is a good question. So in my lecture notes, I actually had some courses that you could check out if you're, just a sec, here. So this science and religion course that is offered at the U of A would actually maybe answer that question fuller than I'm about to, but I took it and I'll give you the Coles notes. What that professor would say is that science can be understood as our attempt to understand the physical world, whereas religion is our attempt to understand the metaphysical world. And so the tools that we use to understand physical properties and the tools that we use to understand metaphysical properties, they're just different tools, you know? And it's not to say that there aren't crossovers potentially, like if you are a religious person, you could perhaps think that, I don't know, in the course, I think he went into the example of like the flood. Like you could think that there's this metaphysical thing that causes this physical thing, but the tools that we have to, you know, observe that kind of differ. And I know that's like not a satisfactory, like it's not a satisfying answer. I know I'm kind of dodging the question, but what I really am trying to say is that if we can help people understand that they aren't mutually exclusive, you can be a scientist and be religious. You can, you know, not be religious and not trust science. Like I think you're right that there is a relationship, and I think that does boil down to this. I think in the course he calls it the metaphysics principle. That's what his term for it. I really like the course. You can find all the notes online if you're interested in reading more about it. But yeah, like helping people understand that there is a place for science, there is a place for religion, and they don't have to be at odds. You know, like this is part of that, you know, critical thinking, expanding that understanding of the world, like expanding what we understand things to be. I again don't know really how we do that. Like it's the same kind of issue that we run into with trying to think about scientific literacy in general. Like how do we communicate these ideas to people in a way that doesn't feel condescending or doesn't feel like we're trying to tell them what to think? Like ultimately, these are things that people need to kind of come to the conclusion on their own. Like if deep down you don't see that distinction between physics and metaphysics, like you're not going to be persuaded by my argument, right? I don't know, I'm kind of rambling, but does that make sense?
Yeah, that's totally fair. And I think I'll have to check out those notes from that class. Is it okay if I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So I guess my question now is there really space, like, because I think it's unavoidable to say that there are overlaps between what religious people consider the physical and the metaphysical. And the example that I'm thinking of is, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses. They're against body modifications. For example, blood transfusions, they're against that. And I'm assuming they're going to be against a whole bunch of other transhumanist concepts like artificial parts and things like that. And so that there's the interaction between the physical and metaphysical for these people. And so how would you handle the concept of autonomy for these people in the future where things like artificial parts are common?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important to note, first of all, that there are like various organized, like transhumanist organizations that are also religious. Like there's a Mormonist transhumanism community, I think, and also like Christians for transhumanism. I don't know, you can Google them. I think you can find them on like the Humanity Plus website somewhere. But I think it comes down to these values that I was describing earlier, you know, being able to tolerate other people's decisions and to help facilitate, like, because autonomy ultimately is about you making choices for yourself, right? And there's definitely like an argument about the slippery slope, like was brought up earlier about, you know, when does your autonomy get to inflict on my well-being, my life? But I think how you can appeal to, you know, this demographic is to be able to explain, like, it's your choice to do these things. You know, here are the tools to help you understand what you want to do with these things. You know, maybe you're like with the religious argument, your values are stemming from a metaphysical place that is like totally cool. You're, you know, like, I'm not going to try to evaluate those decisions using science or whatever because they're just different things. But you're entitled to use those values, use those, you know, priorities, the whatever, to actually make your own choice, as long as it's not just forcing onto others. It's messy. I'm not saying it's not, but does that make sense? Does that kind of get what you were talking about?
Yeah, really good points. Thank you, Taryn. I do think that it's given me a little bit more to think about. I think it's a difficult question to answer for sure.
No, it's very difficult, right? Like when we're talking about all this, like when I read the Transhumanist Declaration, and I think I kind of told you guys this last week, like that whole autonomy point just made my head spin a little bit. Like I don't know what the right answer is about who gets to make decisions, and how far it can go and which ones should be developed and everything. But I think having these, like bringing it back to the basics of like, okay, these are your values, this is what the options are, you don't have to do anything, but also respect that other people, like it's a mutual respect thing, like I respect the fact that you get to make your choices, you have to respect that I get to make my choices. Lots of people aren't on board with that a lot of the time, but I think having that conversation, having that value is really important in actually making sure people get to live their best life. Very idealistic. I'm not pretending it's like nice and cut and dry. Does anyone else have anything to say while I read the chat?
Oh, I have something to say about the autonomy question.
Okay, go ahead.
So a lot of us have, and me as well, like I think education will be a really big portion of getting people like to have more autonomous character, to be like to know the technologies that you're using and to engage with it in a literate way will be important to the adoption of these technologies. However, like I would like to say, so a lot of people probably just don't care, or it doesn't affect them in their daily lives. Like in our current world, someone who is working out in the oil field would probably not care too much about all the technology going into their social media, but they still use it, they still engage with it, and they still contribute to the problems and the good parts of what makes social media work. So as larger and more complicated technologies come in, I feel like that would be more of a bottleneck, or it will become a further bottleneck for people to be like to be more autonomous in that way. Like you wouldn't be able to know absolutely every little part of what makes your technology work. And so like policies and like the whole like whichever policy making body, even if it's the company that made the technology putting in regulations for themselves, they're kind of taking that into consideration, that a lot of these underlying things people will not know about, and so you kind of have to work around them in a lot of ways. And you see that all throughout human history. Not everyone is going to be a policymaker or even have the knowledge going in to, I guess, fully understand the repercussions of their actions. And so what ways would you be able to, I guess, adopt these technologies and not have really serious side effects of people not using them properly and such, given that not many people, not everyone will not everyone will know how to use those technologies.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do not know how my cell phone works. People have tried to explain these things to me, and it's just not my wavelength, And so I think it's definitely a concern as things become, like, as there's more technology, as technology gets more and more complex, like how that disparity between like what people might know and what this really niche thing does might widen. But I think encouraging like curiosity and kind of that critical thinking, curiosity mindset, like if we tried to integrate that as like a cultural thing, and which again, I'm not pretending that's easy, right? But if we can encourage people to be curious, to think critically by actually reaching out to them on like the platforms that they're already using, reaching out, like making it relevant to their lives, like showing them how it matters to them. I don't think it's, like I said, like it's, you can't just put it in some like obscure box in some obscure library. They're not going to find it. They're not going to care. And so you actually have to figure out like how to, you know, reach people, get them to care. I don't know how to do it.
Yeah, like I agree. Like if companies would be more outward with how they're designing these technologies and like how the individual consumer interacts with it. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, social media, it's only recently that even the higher ups have come out and said
Mhm.
a lot of these consequences weren't envisioned in the beginning, but it was just something, you know, for them to get more ad revenue or just to be more profitable as a company. They're not doing it maliciously. So even the people who are running these companies aren't exercising full autonomy over their own technology. And so like even
No,
more like I guess I lean more towards like a centralized approach or having more government involvement, just because I don't feel like individual, like it would just be too much of a bottleneck in my opinion to have like future technologies be implemented properly if we have to educate and find ways to, I guess, envelop everyone's lives in it. It's just, I feel like it's a lot for the everyday person, and I'm not saying that it won't enrich their lives in any way. It's just, it's also a question of you're kind of forcing them to know like all these technologies to a larger scale than maybe they wanted to, and would limit what they would want to do with their lives. Like if they don't want to adopt it, they're gonna have to, since everyone else in their society is using it, and they're gonna be a product of it either way. And so you'll kind of enter a situation where autonomy is either limited for people who aren't engaging or don't want to. And you kind of don't have a place for those people unless you have like policies that are able to incorporate just any individual, regardless of what their education is, regardless of what their background or interests are, that it would work for a society no matter what.
Yeah, and it's like it's hard to break down these they're complicated concepts. How do you break them down in digestible ways, right? How do you make it like in an ideal world, the producers of knowledge, the producers of technology would help facilitate access to this knowledge, right? Like they kind of what I was talking about in these points, like they would maybe start using, you know, different visual ways of communicating how these things work. You know, maybe they would, I don't know, do Q&As or create more information at not even like at simple levels so that, you know, the lay person can understand it, but also at deeper levels so that people can potentially start getting, do you know, like actually elevating their knowledge. We don't want to just keep people at an arm's length forever. We want to help them build, and not only for like their own curiosity, but also just learning more. And I don't know, it's a complicated issue, right? Yeah. I hope that kind of answers your question. I think we'll go back to So Young. Yes.
I think so. I've been thinking about, because I work with a population that is quite marginalized. I work with a homeless population, and it made me think about when technology and different products are starting to become normalized, like how can we make it accessible for these folks who, like now some of my clients just refuse to use the phone because they have mental health issues and they're paranoid. Or, you know, like we see all these like misinformation and misunderstandings of technology, how we see it being produced in like because of a social issue. But I think it can be really solved, like issues of like, how do we make it accessible for people with mental health issues? How do we make it accessible for people with disabilities? Is having people like when we're making products, I think it is like to make that product an accessible product, we have to include people who are marginalized and who don't have access to knowledge to be part of the conversation. Like maybe have in part of your development team, like include someone who is a person of color, or like include someone who has like a physical or like invisible disability. And I think like including people in those conversations not only make the products more positively impactful, like we can kind of like mitigate, we can already start mitigating like all the possible issues that people might have when it comes to accessibility of different products and technologies and whatnot. So it's just, I just wanted to point that out. I think that it's like something that people kind of fail to realize is like we can kind of solve a lot of the issues by being inclusive and actually hearing firsthand experiences and someone who has a perspective that can like kind of represent, obviously not to the full scope because disability is a very individual thing. But yeah, I think that kind of answers some questions.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, I think you're tying a lot into the study that we call phenomenology. So for those who might not be as familiar with it, it's something they talk a lot about in like women's studies, feminist studies, other like philosophical endeavors as well. But phenomenology describes, you know, kind of the experience of being, you know, how being in a body, being in the world is an experience and how it differs for all of us, you know? I think it's really easy to assume that, you know, it's comforting, I think, for us to assume that other people just experience the world like we do, and that it makes it, you know, like that these solutions that we come up with are just going to be the greatest for everybody. But a big topic in this phenomenology field is the concept of situated knowledge. And so what we mean by that is that people who are like, so Young was saying, you know, people who are in different positions of power in these messy webs that I was talking about, how they might approach a problem differently, or how they might have a different kind of experience with the things that we're creating. And so you're right, it's not just a matter of like developing this super cool new gadget and then putting it into this person's hand, you know, like for someone who has a disability, maybe like they can't use it with their hands, maybe they need other accommodations. And yeah, it gets really messy. It gets hard to, you know, incorporate these voices, incorporate this situated knowledge. I've been doing like a lot of reading about how, you know, we can still do like empirical science, all the good things, and still try to bring in that situatedness, that type of knowledge. I think a lot of the time they're kind of seen as very different categories. And I think that hopefully especially as we like try to get towards more personalized medicine, more personalized technology, I think that understanding that, you know, that situated knowledge, that experience of being that each person has will really impact where these personalized things will go. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Anka, would you like to tell me things now?
Yeah, for sure. My name's Anka, by the way, but thanks for calling on me. I was just thinking about how there might be ways to make the conversations around like decision making and new technology more appealing. And like what came to mind was like through media, like shows and movies, because a lot of really great conversations have come about with me and my friends after we watch episodes of Black Mirror or like the documentaries, like The Social Dilemma. And I think that maybe a piece that we could like add on to existing media is if if there are documentaries that are showing perspectives from different organizations, maybe like they could put a little tag at the end of the documentary where people can voice their thoughts and opinions afterwards. Or if we could just be more conscious about how like fictional accounts of things actually do have a big impact in steering conversations, and that could be something interesting and appealing to explore.
No, I definitely feel, I definitely agree, right? Like it's something that I think we've seen with like the inclusion of, you know, different races in certain media, of LGBT representation. You know, we don't just passively consume things, even if it's just on in the background, right? Like those things that we're consuming on a daily basis do, you know, have an impact on us, whether we critically evaluate it or we just kind of chill out. Like it does. Yeah, I think it's definitely a really great tool that should be used to kind of start these conversations. And I think they are being started, right? Like you said, like the Black Mirror is definitely eye-opening and definitely starts a certain kind of conversation, right? And I think we need to really prioritize, like we need to think about who gets to make these documentaries too, right? Like we need to make sure that it is, you know, people's voices who aren't being heard. Like we need to make sure that those are being amplified and that they're being amplified authentically. You know, we're not just taking their story and pandering to people or, you know, kind of making it feel inauthentic. Like building that compassion and that understanding is a very complicated process, but definitely something worth pursuing. If anybody has anything else to say, go ahead. I'm just going to skim through. Actually, we'll just go to this. So I asked you guys, what does misinformation look like? You guys have given me some very real examples, but they make me sad. Oh man, Pizzagate. I don't even want to, we're not going to go there, but yes, you've got it. I think misinformation really plays on sensation and being exciting and being novel and also playing on people's emotions, right? Like they'll use really strong adjectives, or they'll try to play on pre-existing values, pre-existing ideas, and maybe those ideas that are already there aren't great and they're just kind of capitalizing on them. Yeah, I think we're all kind of there. I think when I asked who should be responsible for the spread of misinformation, folks said policymakers, thought leaders, the media, yeah, the algorithms. I think you're right. Like the algorithms, I guess we need to do a plug for, what was it called? The Social Dilemma? Is that what that movie was called? Okay, well, we need to do a plug for that one because we really don't know how all of these algorithms work, right? Like they're kind of shady, and the people in charge don't always really know how they work fully either. Maybe there's one guy in like some back room somewhere that actually knows, but I think we definitely need to think about how we're using, because it's artificial intelligence, a lot of it, right? I think we'll get into that more later in the course about how artificial intelligence is developed and how it's executed, but I think that's definitely something worth paying attention to, right? Like how do we make sure that algorithms are humane? How do we make sure that they're not just like they're too efficient? They're too efficient at funneling us into our separate little camps, and we need to figure out ways to help combat that, but also inspire people to, you know, do something about it for themselves too. It's this balance of asking people to do it, but also, you know, looking at the policymakers, looking at the people making these things, and be like, why? Okay, and then, okay, so yeah, you guys gave me a lot of great information on how we can like maybe some interventions that would reduce people's inclination to spread misinformation. I can't talk, it's been a long hour. So yeah, fact checkers, yeah, just getting a lot of information about, pre-bunking. What is it? Predicting misinformation and then debunking it before it can circulate. I like that idea. I think that like that ties back to the whole being proactive thing that we were talking about, right? Being like making sure that we're on the right course and that we're not just gonna try to clean up the mess if it happens when it happens. Yeah, and then talking about like different geo things. I'll let you guys read this, and then I haven't had time to go through the chat. I'm really glad to see that it's nice and busy. Does anyone, I'll download the chat and then post some of the stuff on the eClass form, and we can have maybe like continue those discussions over there. And there was a question on there that I've been meaning to answer. I'm getting to it. I want to think on it first. But does anyone have any comments that they want to verbalize to me about what I missed in the chat? Yeah, I see people talking about, including like older folks in this conversation as well. I definitely think that's a very important point. Like, especially how there seems to be a pretty significant difference in how older generations and different, not even like older generations, different communities, like they use different tools, they use different social medias, they use them differently. My grandma still posts in all caps on my wall, like once a week, even though I haven't been on Facebook for like a year. But yeah, to be mindful of the fact that this conversation needs to reach people in the places that they already are, not just focusing on one thing one thing in particular. We definitely need to make it a very inclusive project. Oh my goodness. I like that you guys said so much. Okay, yeah. Does anyone have a TLDR for me? Anything that you want to tell me about?
I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on what like, I know it's back to the politics again, but in what government structure currently would be best for a transhumanist, like for a transhumanist ideology? Like what would be more readily adopted in a society, depending on what their political ideology is? Like, I mean, like an example for let's say China and the US, like who would adopt these new technologies more efficiently to better their society?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm totally, like, I think it's good to, like, it's uncomfortable for us to have political decisions because I think that's kind of something that's been made a little taboo, but it's a political project, in my opinion. It directly affects what we're doing, how we're doing it, when we're doing it. But I think when we look at countries that, like, I don't know, I'm kind of in love with Sweden and like Norway, and I feel like they, kind of this, I don't know, it's hard to say, right? Because I don't know if it's a political structure or if it's a value system that just happens to already exist with this political structure, I think it's a lot more than just saying one type of government is going to do it and all the other governments like couldn't handle it. I think that whatever structure is used, it would be good to have, like, start getting scientists directly involved, have elected officials, and alongside that have scientists who are very openly informing public policy, helping to guide these things. But yeah, I don't have a great answer for that. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I guess it was mainly in terms of like like you said, scientists involving the public with public discourse and education. Some governments or some societies might not think that's important. Like I know China doesn't really, like it's very, very centralized in how it deals with technology and the use of and like capitalization. Like they aren't a capitalist society, but they are adopting capitalism to build most of their economy and recover from the years and years of just economic stagnation from their past as well. But just their whole like ideology on how like people should be, how society should operate. Like there's not really an elected official elected within the party maybe, but I guess they would have a more top-down approach in regulation, have the government fully consider everything on the table and not just have it because it is profitable and because it fits a certain list of rules, we will let it go. Like the government will always be at the decision making front, like no matter where or what. Like they aren't waiting for these companies to show them that it works. They will be there and make sure that it works with them, or it works to the way that they want it to.
So, you know, there are always surprises. There are always exceptions. When you think about China, there are many things happening that one would regret. But if you think of the writer Yuval Noah Harari and what happens when he goes to China, it's really cool. So they have a concert, a named concert in his honor, musical concert. And then he meets with the leaders of the country one-on-one and tells them what he thinks, you know. Now, I can't see any evidence that he's altered any, you know, governmental decisions, but it's still really cool that he has that access. I don't know quite how it happened or, you know, whether it's just an accident with him or whether many other people have that kind of direct access with the government's leaders. But it's something we might encourage in other countries, right? So anyway, so you can't make any sort of blanket assumptions about one country versus others. I just wanted to talk a moment about Thursday. You are not required to go to both sessions, but you certainly can. And, you know, I like surprises. I guarantee you there will be surprises Thursday. Let's take Nepal, the Nepalese contingent. They're very enthusiastic about the 7:30 session. The power cuts in Nepal are not always predictable. And they're sort of philosophical about that. So, I mean, despite all their excited preparation, they might not be able to show up if there's a power cut. So there are a whole lot of things like that that will influence what happens on Thursday. But I sort of feel whatever happens, it's going to be consequential and historic and important. And, you know, we're so honored to have David Wood joining us. And yeah, it's just really, really cool. So that's part of the excitement, that we don't really know exactly what's going to happen and how many people will be there. Like we've had 18 participants today. The first two sessions, we had 22. The medical students have filled out a form that kind of predicts when they're coming and when they aren't, because they can't really come every time. And today was one of the times when it looked like substantially fewer medical students would be here. So yeah, maybe, but we have seen 4 fewer. But anyway, we could end up with the whole 33 people, you know, the named students associated with the course, plus others on Thursday. We could get numbers up into the 40s. Who knows, you know? Anyway, stay tuned. Those of you who don't do mornings, who've never done a 7:30 Zoom call, you don't have to come for that one. We'd be happy to accommodate you at 2. But anyway, I'm really looking forward to Thursday. And Taryn, thank you very, very much for the excellent session today. And really, the conversation doesn't ever have to end. I mean, that's the purpose of the eClass forum and Slack and so on. Yeah, so anyway, thanks to all of you for your participation today. Yeah. So you don't have to stay on, and I know as time goes on, more and more of you will have to leave, but also we don't have to stop now if people want further discussion.
Nadia had her hand up for a while. Would you still like to make your...
I was just gonna say, like, about the question about what the best political or economic system would be to like facilitate the transhumanist project. I was just gonna say, like, maybe that's a problem for AI to figure out. Maybe we're too constrained by our own mortal human minds, and AI could find a government, a political, economic system that works to the benefit for all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely, yeah, and it's like when we're talking about these, like I was kind of saying, like it's hard to say if it's just the political structure or if it's actually the values that we have in our society, right? Like I think I've tried to make a case here for, you know, democracy and these values being like a good foundational place for this kind of project, but I'm sure none of us here can fully know what the best solution would be, right? So I like that idea. Yeah.
Okay, well, any other questions or discussion?
I will, I've downloaded the chat, so I'll try to sort through it and kind of start some different like forum topics so we can maybe expand on these things more, because I didn't even get a chance to read all of this. I love it.
Yeah.
Actually, Dr. Solas, I wanted to ask you something.
Sure.
Because sort of the technological revolution is sort of meant to be an international sort of milestone and sort of something we should be trying to strive to do worldwide instead of just in like first world countries and Western democracies. Like I'm sort of paraphrasing the intellectual Noam Chomsky here, but and he's sort of known to be like a social dissident and the such. But I think in like 1996 he gave a talk where he said that the U.S. is very hypocritical in the sense that if you think about the definition of, for example, peace policy, right? The actual definition of peace policy is just something that prevents conflict and, peace process, not peace policy. Peace process is something that just prevents conflict or ends conflict in a certain area. But he also states at the same time, the actual definition of peace process seems to be defined by the United States government and also the media groups within the United States, like the New York Times. An analysis of the New York Times articles from, I think, 1960 to 1996 at the time was through analysis of around 800 of their articles where they mentioned a peace process. None of the times, nowhere was the United States on the other side of the argument. So it has become a sense that anything that the U.S. government supports is a peace process, and that has become the thing that defines something that is a peace process. So,
but what you must admit is the events of the last few weeks have lessened most people's feeling that the U.S. is the model we should follow. Right? I think we would all agree with that. So in a very real sense, what you're talking about has been a powerful force, and it's also obviously changing. I don't know what the new favored model is going to be, or which papers and which media sources will, surpass the New York Times, if any of them do. But it's quite apparent that we're watching this change before our eyes, right? This is not like a static, rigid problem. It has changed since January the 6th, right? Changed quite a lot. Yeah.
But do you think there will eventually be a new standard anyways? Because I mean, the US got to the standard where it was because of a grueling Cold War. Do you think the world would ever sort of go through anything like that again to actually establish a new standard?
Oh, sure. There will be a new standard. You don't need Cold Wars to do that. Other forces can do that. Even the pressure of, machines being obviously smarter than we are, that's going to be something we have not encountered before. But, eventually that will be the situation that humans all over the world face. The one thing we count on before is we were the smartest species. Now the one thing that's for sure is we're not the smartest species. What do we do now? So yeah. No, I guarantee you things will change. And you guys, what's the purpose of taking this course? I mean, this kind of, emergence of the extraordinary young person, that's kind of a wild card that nobody's thinking about, right? When you look at the list of like wild cards, the things that could change everything, they never say a bright young person comes in and solves X, but you realize that could happen. So you're kind of the wild card of wild cards, you guys. So it's not just you're sitting back and learning about this stuff. You could actually be a prime mover in making changes, creating new standards, all sorts of things like that. Time is on your side. So anyway, yeah. So any other discussion? I think I'll stop the recording now and end the meeting, and I'll see you on Thursday. Thanks very much for today.
Thank you.